So we're now going to move on to the second speaker, who is Dr. James Wright, who's a graduate of Ohio State University and trained at the Washington University in St. Louis, was very much involved in islet cell chemistry, then went to Dalhousie, and then most recently at the University of Calgary, where he served as head of pathology and laboratory medicine until just a year ago. He's got into medical history quite early in life, and meeting Michael Bliss a long time ago when he was just a student, and he became, through his many publications in medical history, the recipient of the American Association for the History of Medicine's William Osler Medal. He's given a very provocative title for today, which is Events, Fanfare, and Fallout, following the Nobel Prize awarded to Banting and Macleod. Please ask James Wright to come forward.
Thank you. So in 1982, Michael Bliss published The Discovery of Insulin, compellingly documenting that Banting, Best, Collip, and Macleod all played essential roles. The timeline for my presentation and many of the quotations are taken from Michael's book. I also relied heavily on Christopher Ruddy and the Defining Moments Canada Insulin 100 website. So on October 26th, local and national papers covered the Nobel Prize announcement. The coverage noted that this was the first Nobel Prize in any category awarded to Canadians, and only the second Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine awarded to North Americans. So on the morning of the 26th, Banting, who had been visiting his parents, drove back to Toronto, and it went straight to his office where the phone was ringing. Banting heard of the news from a friend and was immediately enraged about the inclusion of Professor Macleod. Banting later wrote, and I quote, "I rushed out as fast as possible to the laboratory as I was going to tell Macleod what I thought of him. When I arrived at the building, John Fitzgerald was on the steps. He came up to meet me, and knowing I was furious, he took me by the arm. I told him that I would not accept the prize, that I was going to cable Stockholm, and not only would I not accept, but they and that old fogey, August Crow, could go to hell. I defied Fitzgerald to name one idea that had originated in Macleod's brain, or to name one experiment that he had done with his own hands," end quote. So Fitzgerald told Banting that Gooderham, chair of the U of T Insulin Committee, wanted to see him in his office. So Gooderham congratulated Banting, told him to hop on a boat immediately, get to Stockholm and collect his prize. He offered to cover the travel expenses, and according to Banting, and I quote, "The weight of his presence cooled me down. He was the one man whose calm and strong personality reminded me of my father," end quote. So notably, 13 months earlier, Gooderham, recognizing that the Banting-Macleod controversy was damaging the reputation of the university, had asked Banting, Best, and Macleod to each provide a written summary of the events leading to the discovery. Each did. While this approach didn't resolve the differences, it worked out well for Banting. Banting's story was quickly circulated by his friends Billy Ross and Velvian Henderson to the press, as well as some influential politicians. This resulted in the Ontario government establishing the Banting and Best Chair of Medical Research at U of T, with Banting as its permanent holder, with a generous salary in May of 1923, as well as the Government of Canada awarding a generous lifetime annuity in June of 1923. So Banting was now an independently wealthy man. In stark contrast, Macleod's version was suppressed by U of T and only revealed after the last of the discoverers had died. Gooderham had not asked Collip, the biochemist, for a written summary, as he had already returned to Alberta. So Banting later wrote that Gooderham, and I quote, was one of the few men who knew the whole story, and he said words to the effect that he understood my feelings and that he agreed with me, but there were other considerations that must be taken into account. I must think of my country. What would the people of Canada think if the first Canadian to receive this honor were to turn it down? That there was the science to consider. What would the world think of scientists who, because of differences of opinion, would disagree about a prize? I had not thought of that aspect of the situation. He did not ask me to decide immediately, but asked me not to do anything rash and better wait 24 hours. So Banting immediately decided to accept the prize and to split the cash with Best. He telegraphed Harvard Medical School, where Best was speaking to medical students, and asked his telegram be read aloud at, quote, any meeting or dinner, end quote. The telegram read, and I quote, I ascribe to Best equal share in the discovery, stop. Hurt that he is not so acknowledged by the Nobel trustees, stop, will share with him, end quote. So there's no record of Macleod's immediate reaction as he was crossing the Atlantic. But on November 2nd, he landed in Montreal, and a Toronto Star reporter asked his thoughts about Banting sharing his money. Macleod replied, quote, it was very handsome for Dr. Banting to divide that amount of money, a fine thing to do. But Dr. Banting is a very wealthy man now. You may be sure, however, that my decision will be in no way influenced by the action of others. But it was. So within a few days, Macleod telegraphed Collop, offered him half of his prize money, and Collop accepted. So on November 5th, Robert T. Nobel, a longtime leader of organized medicine in Toronto, hosted a dinner at the dining hall of the U of T Faculty Union with a guest list of 70 prominent local medical men in Macleod's honor. Notably, Nobel was the father of E. Clark Nobel, Macleod's student who lost the coin toss with Charlie Best to be Banting's student assistant. And so here I'm quoting from the press coverage the next day. A prophet may be without honor in his own country, but not a professor of physiology who is, if not the greatest, one of the greatest physiologists in the world. It was impossible for any scientist to receive a heartier expression of approval from professional brethren. Professor Macleod had just returned from 5 months' absence in Scotland, where he had delivered the Cameron Lectures in Physiology. The banquet was arranged not only to express Toronto's relief at receiving safely back the coping stone to its foundation of medical science, but also to acknowledge long-standing indebtedness to one who had made many remarkable contributions to the advance of modern physiology. Dr. Nobel opened the floodgates of praise for Professor Macleod as a scientist famous not only for his own discoveries, but for his ability to teach and guide the investigation of others. So the article noted that Macleod's presence had made, quote, Toronto University one of the greatest medical magnets on the continent. And as an example, they used Oscar Klotz, the new U of T professor of pathology, who had been recruited from the University of Pittsburgh and was present at the dinner. And he had very complimentary things to say about Macleod. And they finished the evening off by serenading, he's a jolly good fellow. So on November 7th, Macleod told the press, quote, it would be invidious to try to dissect or divide up the work on insulin among the various men who are engaged in it. The University of Toronto would like to emphasize that it is teamwork that did it. We found that we are engaged on a work that appeared to have in it great benefit to mankind, and our aim was to hurry it along as fast as we could to completion. Other work was dropped. It was on the basis of understanding that Collop, who was on leave of absence from Alberta University, came into the work with us. Dr. Collop made very important contribution to the work, and his share was equal to that of others, end quote. So when asked about his own role, Macleod laughed and told the press he was the impresario, the managing director. So Macleod's statement about Collop's equal role in the team effort angered Banting, and Macleod was forced to clarify a few days later. So I'm quoting, "The statement that Dr. Collop was entitled to an equal share of credit for his part in the work was not quite properly phrased. It might be more accurate to say he is entitled to a fair share of the credit. If I use the word equal, I should not have done so." So on November 26th, U of T held a special convocation, and honorary Doctor of Science degrees were awarded to Banting and Macleod. This was followed by a banquet with 400 guests in the Great Hall of Hart House. The after-dinner speeches of Banting and Macleod were carefully crafted so as to only hint at underlying issues. So here you can see the coverage in the Star and the Globe. I'll be quoting from the Star. "So, on behalf of the workers in Ensslin," said Dr. Banting, "I wish to thank the Board of Governors and also my teachers in this university, and chiefly Professor J.J. Macleod. Whatever he put his stamp to was like the Bank of England impress on a note. He made it more valuable," end quote. So in other words, he didn't claim that Macleod had actually done anything other than just approve of what he had done. So another quote is he thanked Mr. Best and Professor V. Henderson, professor of pharmacology, because he's been the truest friend and best guide of all. If they were proud that insulin had remained a Canadian product, it was to Professor Henderson that Canada owed this honor. Macleod received equally enthusiastic ovation when he rose to speak, to show how insulin had been brought to a successful issue in no short a time. He compared the advance of science to the advance of an army. The army was composed of many specialized units, yet acted as a harmonious whole. Every advance was preceded by a long period of preparation. It was 30 years since the discovery of carbohydrate metabolism. That had been the starting point of the attack on diabetes. Banting and Best had been the shock troops who carried the last stronghold, end quote. J.B. Collop, by painstaking and enlightened work, had assisted materially in clearing up great difficulties. Doctors Nobel, Hepburn, and Latchford also deserved great credit for demonstrating the full physiological and therapeutical effects of the new material evolved by the biochemist. Only by teamwork was it possible, said Professor Macleod. So although both Nobel laureates were well behaved at the dinner, Llewellyn Barker, 1890 U of T medical graduate who succeeded William Osler as physician-in-chief at Johns Hopkins, and who was obviously aware of the rifts between Banting and Macleod, famously commented, quote, "In insulin, there is glory enough for all," end quote. So life in Toronto became increasingly unpleasant for Macleod as Banting continually maligned him. Best self-servingly sided with Banting. Macleod was progressively victimized by the Banting and Best myth, essentially a fairy tale that Macleod had done nothing and that Banting's Nobel Prize co-recipient should have been Best. And here I'm quoting a longtime insulin scientist, Jesse Roth. Quote, "Everybody warmed to the Hollywood-like myth of two novices, a surgeon and a medical student, who came out of nowhere and during their first summer, while the professor who provided the lab was away on vacation, succeeded in a task that had stymied many professional researchers who came before them. Bliss estimated that 400 labs had attempted the feat," end quote. So I'd like to point out even children's books were teaching this feel-good fairy tale. So let's move on to the summer of 1924. Macleod, in part to get away from Banting, conducted research on fish insulin at the Atlantic Biological Station in St. Andrews, New Brunswick. It was a pleasant getaway for the Macleods. Macleod's fish insular research during the summer of 1922 had contributed to his selection as co-recipient of the 1923 Nobel Prize, as it was the definitive proof that the islets were the source of insulin. Macleod, knowing that certain bony fish have anatomical separation of their endocrine and exocrine pancreata, had made extracts from both and shown that only the islet extracts contained insulin and that it was a highly concentrated source. So this next slide shows the sculpin, which is the fish species that Macleod liked, dissected, and the large bold red arrows show these principal islets. So there'd been an immediate insulin shortage, and the yield from beef pancreas was so low in 1922 and early 1923 as to suggest there would never be enough insulin to meet clinical need. So Macleod sent 2 students to the maritime provinces to explore the production of insulin from cod islets. So cod insulin was successfully used to treat patients at the Toronto General Hospital in 1923. So here you can see the 2 students, Norman McCormick and E. Clark Nobel. So both students studied both inshore and offshore cod fisheries in 1923. So on the left, we see a child harvesting cod principal islets while fishermen gut fish at Grand Manan Island in New Brunswick. This proved to be a highly cost-effective source of insulin, but the inshore fishery was too small to be practical. So the students went to sea on the steam trawler Venasta and determined that offshore fisheries presented many logistical problems. So here you can see, by early 1924, it was clear that it was impractical to produce insulin from fish islets. And by this time, isoelectric focusing had also improved the yield from livestock pancreas. So fish insulin was abandoned. And so this time when Macleod went back to St. Andrews, he was pursuing pure basic science research. So here you can see Macleod and McCormick doing research with fish. And here are a couple of the papers that they published from that summer's work. So let's move on to the acceptance speeches. So on May 26, 1925, Macleod gave his Nobel acceptance speech. It was about 4,900 words long. It focused on the work of predecessors that made the discovery possible. It emphasized that the work in Toronto was that of a team, and he specifically mentioned the work of each of the trainees in his laboratory who contributed. He mentioned the work of a total of 69 investigators. 4 of 27 paragraphs are devoted to fish insulin. Banting is specifically mentioned in only 3 sentences. And this is the primary sentence. So I'm quoting, believing that the one of success to prepare extracts of uniform potency as due to the destruction of the anti-diabetic hormone by digestive enzymes also present in the gland, F.G. Banting suggested preparing them from duct-ligated pancreas with the aid of C.H. Best and under my direction, he succeeded in showing that such extracts reduced hyperglycemia and glycosuria in depancreatized dogs, period. The general symptoms of diabetes were also found to be alleviated and the duration of life of depancreatized animals prolonged by the repeated injections of alcoholic extracts of fetal as well as adult ox pancreas. So Macleod always gave Banting full credit for the idea which initiated the research, that is, inducing exocrine atrophy by ligating canine pancreatic ducts to prevent pancreatic trypsin from destroying the pancreas internal secretion. However, Banting's idea was physiologically unsound, as it was already well known that the proteolytic enzyme trypsin was present in the pancreas in an inactive form. Therefore, Banting and Best had spent the summer of 1921 trying to solve a non-existent problem. It's unlikely that Banting ever realized this. Macleod was afraid to tell him. Current historians of insulin generally agree that Banting's initial idea played no essential part in the discovery of insulin, other than that Banting and Best's promising findings during the summer of 1921 convinced Macleod to focus his laboratory's efforts on the purification, physiological characterization, and eventual clinical application of insulin. Regardless of the idea's merit, Banting recognized that making insulin from duct-ligated dog pancreas was so impractical that this would preclude clinical application. So Banting's next plan was to make extracts from fetal pancreas, which he had read was islet-rich and lacked mature exocrine pancreas. Banting, although working in a meatpacking city nicknamed Hogtown, fortuitously chose fetal calf islets, and his rationale, and I quote, "Having been raised on a farm and being familiar with stock breeding, I knew that cattle are frequently bred before fattening in order to make better feeders. There would therefore be plenty of fetal calves available at abattoirs," end quote. So it's now a known biological fact that fetal mammalian pancreas is an exceedingly poor source of insulin. But there are two exceptions: mid-gestation fetal calves and lambs. Fetal calf pancreata at the gestational age Banting used possessed numerous insulin-rich giant perilobular islets, which explain the high potency of fetal extract. This islet population mysteriously disappears at birth. So the use of non-ruminant fetal pancreata would have failed miserably. Banting and Best found that fetal bovine pancreatic extracts helped keep a depancreatized longevity dog alive for 70 days. This immediately led to purification of insulin from whole adult cow pancreas by Collip. Therefore, Banting's second great idea was much better than his first. According to Bliss, Best regretted for the rest of his life that the extract he and Banting provided the Toronto General Hospital for the initial treatment of Leonard Thompson was not their fetal calf pancreas extract, thus allowing Collip's more purified extract to provide the first successful clinical use. And if you want to hear about this in Best's own words, I actually found a little viewed YouTube where Best talks about the fetal calf islets. So in fact, it bothered him so much that almost 40 years later, or 40 years after the discovery, Best asked some colleagues to produce fetal calf insulin, and they tested it in diabetic patients. It worked beautifully, and it was published in Diabetes in 1961. So this slide just shows the mid-gestation fetal calf islets, and the kind of on the upper right-hand side, you can see these giant perilobular islets. The little tiny brown flecks that you see in the background are normal size islets. These are the giant islets that disappear at birth. So on September 15th, Banting gave his Nobel acceptance speech. It was 70% longer than Macleod's. It describes his idea, his work with Best on ligated canine and fetal calf pancreata, and the clinical applications of insulin. Banting does not acknowledge that Macleod provided facilities, supplies, guidance, hands-on training, or scientific feedback on results. Other than recognizing that it's a joint award when thanking the Nobel Committee, Macleod is mentioned in only 2 sentences, and I'll read both of them to you. Quote, "On April 14th, 1921, I began working on this idea in the physiological laboratory of the University of Toronto, period. Professor Macleod allotted me Dr. Charles Best as an associate," end quote. Then he jumps to 10 months later, and the second time Macleod is mentioned. Quote, "At this stage in the investigation, February 22nd, Professor Macleod abandoned his work on anoxemia and turned his whole laboratory staff onto the investigation of the physiological properties of what is now known as insulin," end quote. So about 10% of Banting's lecture was devoted to the work of Gladys Boyd. a U of T medical graduate who had been appointed the first pediatric endocrinologist at Hospital for Sick Children in 1921. In 1922, diabetes mellitus was believed to be primarily a chronic disease of adults. Childhood diabetes was believed to be exceedingly rare, and the Hospital for Sick Children did not have a diabetes ward. Since the Toronto General Hospital diabetes ward was limited to treating adults, Leonard Thompson's family pretended he was 14 to gain admission. He was actually 13. So this is not widely known, either that childhood diabetes was rare or that the Hospital for Sick Children did not have a diabetes ward. Here you can see a scene from Comet Among the Stars, a movie showing the very busy Hospital for Sick Children diabetes ward with children dying. Within months, parents of diabetic children from Eastern North America bombarded Banting with requests to treat their children. By mid-1922, other diabetic youths were being treated in Toronto. By August 1922, Eli Lilly was providing limited insulin samples for research, and shortly thereafter, researchers in New York City published a study on 9 diabetic children showing astonishingly good results with before and after photographs. The rest is history. The efficacy of insulin in childhood diabetes had been firmly established in less than a year. Because of the continuing controversy with Banting, life in Toronto became increasingly unpleasant for the Macleods, and so he accepted a Regis professorship in Aberdeen. On May 17, 1928, U of T held a farewell dinner at the Great Hall of Hart House. 185 guests attended, and they were led into the hall by a piper. Macleod was seated in front of a Macleod tartan emblazoned with the U of T and University of Aberdeen coat of arms. Banting did not attend and reportedly asked an empty seat conspicuously record his absence. Macleod spoke and described going to Toronto as, quote, the most fortuitous thing that happened in my life, end quote. It was announced that a plaque honoring Macleod would be hung in the physiology department, but this never happened. Best then replaced Macleod as head of physiology, and Banting and Best-Smith thrived until Michael Bliss published his bombshell book in 1982. I considered entitling my talk A Tale of 4 Elegant but Sometime Awkward Dinners in Toronto, but I decided that that would be a little too cryptic for the flyer. But we've discussed 3 of the dinners. I'm going to tell you about the 4th, and it actually figures seriously into the Nobel Prize. So there was a less grand, but possibly more eventful dinner on November 24th, 1922. So 101 years ago, almost to the day. Banting explained his hypothesis for the pathogenesis of diabetes to Macleod and August Crowe at Toronto's York Club. Banting claimed, quote, that an excessive blood supply, hyperemia, causes hypersecretion of insulin from the islet cells and their consequent exhaustion, and further argued that the relationship between excess weight and diabetes stems from drag on the transverse mesocolon and obesity, and that this pressure causes the congestion. He then stated that the rational treatment for diabetes was low sugar intake, insulin if necessary, and wearing a snug abdominal belt to relieve drag on the pancreas. So Crowe, who 1920 Nobel Prize was for pioneering studies on regulation of blood flow to tissue, was understandably astounded by Banting's implausible hypothesis and proposed treatment. So he politely disagreed, but Banting confidently stood his ground. Bliss suggests that it was in this context Crowe nominated both Banting and Macleod, arguing that Banting could not have reached insulin without Macleod's help. In summary, clearly Banting would not have discovered insulin without Macleod, as he lacked the expertise to pursue his idea on his own. Macleod, who had the requisite expertise, would have not made the discovery on his own, as he had mostly moved on from carbohydrate to acid-base research. So both were necessary and neither was sufficient. but together the quartet robbed diabetes of its terror. Sadly, the discovery did not bring the team happiness. Banting's personality was vital to his success, but a major handicap afterwards. Though funded for life, further research success evaded him. Best's role as a student assistant trained in laboratory techniques was equally necessary, but had the coin toss gone differently, Clark Nobel might have performed equally well. Best, who had a highly successful research career, felt slighted by the Nobel Committee and spent the remainder of his life promoting the Banting and Best myth. Nobel, who co-authored 10 early papers on insulin, was forgotten and was bitter about this. Cullop's chemistry skills allowed clinical validation, which differentiated the research in Toronto from all prior work elsewhere. His critical contribution was minimized by Banting and Best. Macleod's stewardship made it all possible. He gave Banting the opportunity to explore his idea, provided sage advice, and recognized the work's potential by the end of 1921, refocused his lab in 1922 to provide physiological insights into insulin's action, looked for other insulin sources, helped develop commercial administrative structures to safely and optimally use insulin worldwide. But before Bliss, history remembered him primarily for stealing much of the credit. So there truly was glory enough for all. The lives of millions of people have been transformed by what they accomplished. So I'd like to conclude with the movie poster for Glory Enough for All. It was a movie, made for television movie on CBC in 1988. And sadly, the four discoverers were never photographed together. This is the only photograph of even three. Thank you.